Bring it.
Bring it.
Benavidez versus Morrell in a night of title fights, February 1st.
Streaming live on ppv.com. Order now.
Hello there, fight fans. It's Marcus Hayes with Fight Hub TV with the one and only, the Mr. Legendary Al Bernstein here. Al, we're here ahead of David Morrell versus David Benavidez, the Battle of David. What do you think about the main event here on Saturday night?
You know, this is a really fun fight, one that I think fans have really looked forward to. Both David Benavidez and David Morrell were hoping to get in the ring with Canelo Alvarez at 168, but that didn't happen, so they moved up to 175, and now here they are in the ring against each other, a fight that I think a lot of people thought eventually might happen. And it's a fascinating matchup. You know, it's Benavidez, the volume puncher, one of the best combination punchers in boxing, against David Morrell with less experience, who has not faced the kind of competition Benavidez has, but a very skilled fighter, got one punch knockout power, and has shown some pretty good boxing skills as well. So it's a fascinating matchup.
And you know, Al, what you just said, I spoke with Bozy Ennis earlier in the week, and Bozy echoed the same sentiment that you had, that Morrell has one-punch KO power, and that David Benavidez may actually be putting himself in harm's way by throwing the volume of punches, that he is kind of exposing himself to danger by being such a volume puncher versus such a dangerous guy. What do you think about that?
Well, that's possible, but the other thing is, when you're a volume puncher like Benavidez, you also, unless that person is going to be the perfect counterpuncher while you're doing all those combinations, it's not that easy to counter them because you are taking a lot of incoming. And the other question is, we've not really seen David Benavidez hurt. You know, he went down once against Ronald Gavril in one of the fights I called of Benavidez by a jab, but that was more of a flash knockdown. So I don't know. I think Benavidez will certainly try to be a volume puncher in this fight. Now, it might take a couple of rounds. Remember the Benavidez fight with Plant, in which Plant boxed effectively, and for the first half of the fight, Plant wasn't necessarily winning all those rounds, but he muted the Benavidez offense that we're talking about a little bit. Morrell has shown some more boxing skills, I think, in recent fights, where he's been more of a boxer, so he may do that, and maybe Benavidez won't get that fluid offense going early, but I think we're going to see it.
When we talk about David Benavidez, one thing that comes to mind when you go to a David Benavidez fight is anger. There's always some sort of vibe in the air where you can almost feel like David is going to jump up from his chair and attack his opponent before the fight starts. This was no different. In LA, they had a confrontation. Miami, they got the belt thrown incident. Here a couple of times, these guys are really trying to go after each other. What do you make of the anger that's been shown by both fighters?
Yeah, I think it seems like it's organic, not created, out of whole cloth. And I don't know if it stems more from David Benavidez or from David Morrell. They've had a checkered history with each other in terms of this fight being on again, off again. The blame game from both camps has been enormous about when that fight did or didn't happen. So there's plenty of history to the idea that both their camps and them might feel a little bit of angst toward each other. And we've seen that in evidence now. We always wonder, and it's always true, that the fighter that can control that and harness it and use it effectively is the one that does well in the ring, and the one that doesn't oftentimes doesn't fare as well.
Lately, what we've seen in the arc of the fight, now that we're here winding the week down, David Morrell Jr. has taken more of an antagonistic tone toward David Benavidez, and it seemed like he's been able to press whatever button. He's got some numbers dialed in here that he knows by heart, it looks like, where he's seeming to get David Benavidez angry just at a moment's notice. Do you think that works for or against David Benavidez?
Well, David Benavidez is an emotional person when it comes to the ring. When it comes to boxing and when it comes to these fights, he's an emotional guy, and I think he's kind of built up this an interesting chip on his shoulder in recent years. that he kind of finds a way to motivate him and push him forward in fights. So Morrell certainly has taken a more aggressive posture. You know, a lot of the fights I announced with David Morrell previous, when I was doing his fights at Showtime, he wasn't an agitator so much. You know, and now maybe it was the opponents because they were good opponents, but it wasn't A-level stuff. And maybe he didn't feel the need to even try and do that. So this fight, I think, is a little bit of a departure from him. So it could be strategic, as you're suggesting, or it could just be him stepping it up because he's just more animated about David Benavidez.
And with David Benavidez being a classically trained Cuban fighter, I mean, they're so tricky. With David Morrell being a classically trained Cuban fighter, magical on defense, hard to hit, good foot mobility. What dangers do you think that he actually poses to Benavidez on fight night that Benavidez needs to look out for?
Yeah, David, you mentioned the fact that Morrell it does move well in the ring, and because of that Cuban influence that he had. Although it's worth noting that his amateur career was mostly in the junior division. You know, we forget he didn't have one of those Cuban amateur careers that was like, you know, all the great Cuban amateurs that we know who went on to win gold medals or even fight in many international competitions. I'm not denigrating what Morrell did as an amateur, but that's an important distinction, I think, to make. However, he has good foot speed, he can move, and I think those kinds of things traditionally for Benavidez have been a little bit of a problem. But here's the thing. In every fight, Benavidez eventually solves that Rubik Cube when people have been able to do it well against him. Plant was an example, and finds a way to get it done. Now, whether he will in this one remains to be seen, but I think that is one of the issues. But here's the thing, if David Morrell chooses to fight that fight and turns himself into a purely a boxer puncher or boxer, does that diminish his chances to win? Because David Morrell came up as a power puncher, right? That was what he was known for. Now, he hasn't always gotten knockouts. Once he stepped up in competition, he didn't always get knockouts. But does that diminish his chance to do some harm to Benavidez? I mean, there are many interesting questions surrounding this fight, and that's one of them.
When you talk about David Benavidez, naturally the next name that comes to mind is Canelo Alvarez. Yeah. Naturally not being able to score the fight with Canelo moving on. Actually, September, Canelo Alvarez rumored to be facing Terrence Bud Crawford in what will be what we haven't had, which is a battle in the ring for comprehensively #1 pound for pound. How do you think that fight goes?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting fight to be sure. You know, for Terrence Crawford, he's coming pretty far up in weight from his original weight class. I mean, to get to 168. Canelo Alvarez, while he started at 154, is very legitimate at 168. 175 is a bridge too far for him, probably. So that's a big issue for Terrence Crawford. Now, Terrence Crawford is a very, very talented guy and a superb fighter. But going up that high in weight, our question in that fight is Crawford going up high in weight, Canelo Alvarez having trouble with the hand speed and quickness of Crawford, and Canelo Alvarez finally, after a long career, starting to show signs that he's, you know, that there's some of his ability and skill set is diminishing a little bit. So you put those two things together and it comes up with a very intriguing fight. It's a daunting task for Crawford, in my opinion, because of the going up so high in weight. However, he has never failed before, and he's a good fighter. I can't imagine Terrence Crawford hurting Canelo. So obviously he has to box very effectively and land lots of combinations, use his hand speed. Canelo can be hit with those kind of punches, but Canelo Alvarez, especially against opponents where he has the power edge, most often finds the way to make that happen either in the mid or later part of the fight.
So safe to say, like a lot of people's sentiments, that Terrence Crawford's key is going to be he's going to need to be able to move around the ring and kind of avoid those vicious exchanges in the middle with Canelo Alvarez and staying off the ropes at the same time.
Yeah, can't stand the ropes. Or if he's not using a lot of lateral movement, then even if when he's in the pocket, he's just going to have to be as skillful defensively as he can be. And land combinations. I mean, we saw, of course, he's a much bigger man. We saw Bivol do that against Canelo Alvarez. Now, when you look at the two men side by side, Crawford he doesn't look like a tiny man compared to Canelo in terms of his height and his reach, and that's significant. But he has to kind of do exactly what Bivol did in that fight with Canelo. And, of course, he also has the advantages of being able to switch to lefty to righty, which is a big plus for him.
And you brought that up about the size difference between Canelo and Terrence Crawford, and it's kind of deceiving, isn't it? Because when you look at both of them together, you look at Canelo Alvarez and you say Canelo is not very much bigger than Terrence Crawford at all. He may be more dense, skeletal muscle-wise, he's more dense. But when you look at it, Crawford's longer arm-wise, he's taller, and that may pose an issue for Canelo on fight night.
Well, it speaks to the fact that for Crawford to accomplish what we're talking about, it doesn't seem impossible, does it? Because it's not as if he's suffering so many physical advantage for that. Now, Canelo's a lot stronger. Canelo has an astonishing chin. He's more powerful. So he has all that going for him. Plus, he's a very skilled fighter too, of course. But now both of these fighters, interestingly, are not volume punchers, really. So I think one of the things that Terrence Crawford's going to want to do in this fight is up his volume. Because, and of course, in the Spence fight, when he had the advantage, he did press it and he threw a lot of punches. And in the Madrimov fight, not so much, but he had a very close decision. But if he's going to win this fight with Canelo, it's very unlikely he's going to hurt him or get a knockout or even a knockdown. So he's going to have to make sure he banks rounds and banks rounds against Canelo, who for whatever reasons you want to speculate, people have a hard time banking rounds against him.
And on to another topic. I mean, there's so much to talk about. When you talk about Canelo Alvarez, and naturally you got to go on to Bivol, like we touched on before. Yeah. Bivol, February 22, Riyadh season, Saudi Arabia, rematch against Beterbiev, and what was an amazing fight before. What do you think Bivol has to do to get the titles back from Beterbiev?
Well, I thought Bivol fought a very good fight against Beterbiev. Not a perfect fight. You can make a case for Bivol winning that decision for sure, but it was a very, very close fight. I think in his case, part of what he didn't do was put his punches together as much as he wanted to, and Beterbiev was able to keep those rounds close, close to where he edged them out. So I think Bivol needs to do more of same, but more of it, and hope that will lead him to victory against Beterbiev. Again, he's not likely to knock Beterbiev out, but he is. If anybody was stunned in that fight, it was probably Bivol. But he's going to have to be he's going to have to have more volume. He's going to have to use his jab a little more than I think he did in that fight. And Beterbiev has a terrific jab, and sometimes you nullify the other fighter's jab a little bit. But I think it's going to be a very good fight. I think we'll actually see. The last one was a good fight, a little more strategic, but with action. This one may have even more action in it. And by the way, that card, in my opinion, might end up being the best boxing card, are you ready? In the history of boxing.
Wow. That is a tall statement.
Maybe. On paper, it's in the top 2 or 3. For sure. And if 5 of the 7 fights live up to what we think they can be, it's going to end up being the best card ever.
And what does that say about Riyadh season and Turki Al-Sheikh making a big splash here in boxing? What do you think his addition to our sport has been thus far?
Well, the major thing is that it's fights are happening that might not otherwise have happened because of the commerce of things, the input of all that money that has kind of created a situation where promoters can't avoid working together. You know, we see Frank Warren and Eddie Hearn, for instance, working together on these cards. And then, you know, bitter rivals for so many years, even going back to Eddie Hearn's dad. And then you look at them and they almost seem like they're kind of enjoying it, you know, when you see them on camera together and everything. So, but I think there's twofold. One, making fights happen that wouldn't have otherwise happened, and also having the ability to put on cards that are filled with great fights. So, you know, the overall question of their involvement is a bigger one and that requires a long conversation. But the fact is, there's no question it has made fights for boxing fans that would not have otherwise been made. And one of the other interesting things, and I don't talk too much about the business of boxing, but if they can keep, you know, a lot of these end up being pay-per-view fights, but they seem to be making an effort to keep the cost at a minimum. If they can do that, along with making those pay-per-view fights and still putting fights on platforms where it's not pay-per-view, then that'll be a good thing for boxing.
And on that card, when you talk about February 22, so many directions I can go with great fights, but I'll stick to one fight that is exciting for a lot of fight fans, and that is Madrimov versus Virgil Ortiz Jr. What do you think about those two coming together?
Yeah, it was going to be Ennis against Ortiz, which would have been spectacular. But Madrimov, who of course fought very well in the Crawford fight, he and Virgil Ortiz, I think, is a great matchup. You know, Madrimov is such a good, solid technician, and Ortiz didn't have an easy outing in his last fight. Again, facing a very good fighter, by the way. I think that fight is going to be hotly contested in every single round. I think it's going the distance. I think either man could be hurt at some point in the fight. I think it's going the distance, and honestly, I see it going right down to the wire and being as close a fight as you could possibly imagine.
From a close fight, one of the closest fights that we can imagine, to a fight that actually had an unbelievably wide result last year out in New York, Ryan Garcia, Devin Haney, all the things that circled around that fight. Rematch looks like it's going to be scheduled here, and what Jim Lampley called a couple days ago a blood feud. What do you think about those two getting together again? What do you think the outcome is?
Well, there's a lot of layers to that. We have the whole issue of the drug situation with Garcia. We have the question of the comportment of everybody around that fight, you know, especially Garcia. And so that one is, I'm going to put it this way. That one says, you know, we just saw with Jake Paul and Mike Tyson, and we've seen with the MVP Promotions, them putting on what we call crossover events that are more pure entertainment. This one comes as close to that as anything that's in boxing, although certainly it's a real fight, because of all the surrounding issues for this fight. It just is fascinating to me because, I mean, Ryan Garcia badly failed his first major test against Gervonta Davis. He was almost a no-show in that fight. Devin Haney, who is not a monstrous puncher, was, when he fought Garcia, and Garcia went up in weight to do it, now which maybe helped him because maybe he couldn't make the 135. But I don't think, very few people really thought Garcia was going to dominate that fight the way he ended up doing. So that's a shocker to fans. And it's forcing Devin Haney to almost reinvent himself, right? Will Devin Haney reinvent himself as the pure boxer that we know he's capable of being, even at 140, and especially there where his power at 135 wasn't dramatic, and at 140 it diminishes in a way it can enhance, but I don't think he's a big puncher. And will Garcia be able to focus on this fight and deliver the same kind of performance that he did the last time? There will be so many questions swirling around this fight, and if we live in an age in which a circus is the best way to promote a fight, which we may be, because that's kind of the way our society is going. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be a philosopher here or get into uncharted territory that'll get me in trouble, but at the end of the day, we're living in a circus. Well, it's a circus, and it's a circus that fans will get a kick out of in a certain way. And that may make it a bigger fight. And then what happens in the ring is something that I think people are fascinated by.
Lots to cover in boxing, fight fans. This is Marcus Hayes with Fight Hub TV with my guy, Mr. Al Bernstein. Again, covering the circus. Look out for the Lions, Tigers, and the Bears. We'll see you again next time. Thank you, Al, for your time.
Thank you.